You know, when we went to Haiti for missions a number of years ago, there was this rooster. And this rooster, we thought he was broken because he was, as roosters tend to be, super loud, and he would crow at all hours of the day or night. And making matters worse, the guys' room, we were on the second floor of where we were staying, and we all swore that this rooster is flying up on the second story window and crowing into the window at like 3 a.m., at 1 a.m. We heard it at like 2 p.m. And so we thought this rooster has a terrible sense of time because he's crowing at all hours of the day or night. Now, in researching this sermon, I learned something new that I will share with you. Roosters don't just crow in the morning, in the dawn. Roosters crow throughout the day for various reasons. It could be they're scared of a predator and they're warning their flock. They crow at night. I didn't know this. And so we were getting so angry at this rooster in Haiti, but we realized in researching the sermon, now I realize he was just being a rooster. Right? Roosters crow at all hours of the day or night for different reasons. Now, today's passage, we're talking about Peter denying Christ and the prophecy that Jesus gave to him that he would deny him, and when that would happen, the rooster would crow. Now, for Peter, basically what Jesus was saying, there's lots of debate because the accounts aren't exactly the same in all the Gospels. But that stuff doesn't matter. The main point of what Jesus was telling Peter is, you claimed you'd be willing to die for me. Well, before the rooster crows, or in other words, before morning. Before the morning comes and the trial is over with the high priests, Peter, you will have all night to prove your words, to prove that you will be faithful to me. But Jesus knew that he wouldn't be. So that's really what he was saying. Now, the very first time Peter denies Christ and there's a rooster crowing, Peter's not going to notice it. Because, again, in Jesus' days, roosters are all over the place. Right? It's normal for roosters to be crowing at all hours of the day or night. So the first time Peter denies Jesus Christ, you would think as you're reading the scripture, well, why didn't Peter hear the rooster crow the first time? Because roosters are crowing all the time. And they're all over the place in Jesus' time. It's kind of like when I first moved to my current ghetto apartment, it's about 1 block from the train station in Old Town Gaithersburg. And man, I could not sleep for the first 2 months, whatever it was. Because every time the train would come by, it would wake me up. And, for safety reasons, when trains, it doesn't matter if it's 2:30 in the morning, it doesn't matter if it's 4 a.m., 5 a.m. When trains are crossing intersections, they have to honk, right, to warn, just in case. And so every single time, it would wake me up, and multiple times throughout the day or night. And now I don't really hear it, right? You get used to it. Your body, you just tune it out, even though the train is still coming at night. And this is the same thing with Peter and this first rooster crow after he denies Christ. He doesn't notice it. He doesn't immediately understand that, oh, this is what Jesus was talking about when he said, you will deny me, right? And so now with that little biology lesson on rooster behavior behind us, let's read the passage. Starting from verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples, too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Verse 25. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, for the sake of presentation, if you remember last week's sermon, like the way that John presents it, it's Jesus being interrogated, then Peter, then Jesus, then Peter. Okay? Now, for a simple presentation, it made it confusing, so I separated that. So last week we looked at all of Jesus' interrogation, and this week we look at all of Peter's interrogation. In the passage we just read, John doesn't identify himself by name, but he never does throughout the gospel. If you've noticed, every time that John is in his own gospel, he'll say like the beloved one or the disciple that outran Peter. And he always throws shade at Peter too. It's funny throughout the gospel. I don't know if you've noticed this. John always throws shade at Peter. And so even here, he doesn't identify himself by name, but most likely it's John here talking too. And as Jesus is arrested and being interrogated by the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, like at the same time is this questioning of Peter happening, right? They're happening at the same exact time. Peter initially isn't even in the courtyard. He can't get in. John, most likely, knowing the high priest and knowing some people, the officials there, he gives Peter permission to enter into the courtyard. And so this is where this happens. This is where this scenario and this scene plays out. And the very first denial of Peter, we see in verse 17. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. So who is she? Well, she is a servant girl who let Peter into the courtyard and asks, are you one of Jesus' disciples? And just to be sure, the tone of her question, it's not neutral, right? The tone of her question is critical, and she's expecting a no from this man. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She's expecting a no. And the reason that she questions Peter, though, is because, and here's another comparison, because John is unashamedly Jesus' disciple. He's going in after Jesus to see what's going on. He's talking to some of the officials. So everyone knows that John is Jesus' disciple in this case. And since John is trying to get Peter into the courtyard as well, she asks the question because she associates them together now. Well, if John's one of Jesus' disciples, maybe this guy Peter is one of Jesus' disciples too. You aren't one of his disciples too, are you? And Peter says, I am not. And that's not a coincidence. Like how many times in the gospel, when Jesus was asked who he was, did he say, I am? Right? Jesus said, I am, over and over and over again, claiming to be God. But Peter here says, I am not. And making matters worse are the societal norms that are going on during the story. Now, again, I'm not saying they're correct. I'm just saying these were the societal norms at that time. Women were clearly subordinate to men. Men were considered more valuable than women in that society. Peter is older than the servant girl. Peter is a male, which in that society, he has a rank. The girl is younger, obviously. The girl is female, obviously. And the girl is a servant, where Peter's not a servant. He's a free man. Even with the power dynamics, all of these in Peter's favor, he caves to pressure and he denies being Jesus' disciple to this servant girl. He denies that Jesus is, like he's under Jesus' flock. The second denial is increasing the emotional stakes. Like when you look at 1, 2, and 3, each time the emotional stakes get higher and higher. So the second denial, we go from one servant girl, like letting him in from the outside door. Now we see there are multiple servants and officials. and it's becoming like more official here. And we see the second denial in verse 18. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself, verse 25. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." Now, it was night. It was cold in the courtyard, and a group of people were warming themselves around a fire. And in the Greek, it identifies what kind of fire it is. It's a charcoal fire. So this charcoal fire, it doesn't give off too much heat, and it doesn't give off very much light. So that's why they can't like clearly identify who Peter is by sight. And also, they have to huddle together because the heat is kind of concentrated in that area. So they're together, huddling close to it. And once again, Peter is asked, "Are you one of Jesus' disciples?" And just to be clear, it's not a neutral question again. When they ask this, it's hostile. And they're expecting again a no. "You aren't one of them too, are you?" Well, no, of course not. And under more pressure now from a group of people, from multiple servants, Peter denies being Jesus' disciple a second time. And in this narrative, where is Jesus and where is Peter? Peter is together standing with Jesus' enemies. He's huddling together with Jesus' enemies right now, physically together. And he's denying being Jesus' disciple while huddling together, standing together with his enemies. Now we got the third denial, and this is the highest, like most intense one yet. Because the third one, like the one who's questioning Peter, is a relative related to the guy Peter tried to kill a little while before. Remember, he's swinging swords at people's heads, and he happens to chop off an ear, but he's not going for an ear. He's just swinging daggers at people's heads. He's trying to kill him. In verse 26, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, the difference between this third question and the other two is the tone of it, where he's really expecting a yes. He phrases it in a question, but it's more like this. "Didn't I see you there?" Like, it's a question, but it's really a statement. "Didn't I see you there?" Like, it's more of, "I saw you there with Jesus in the garden." Yes, that's really what he's saying. "I saw you there." And again, this is the relative of the guy Peter just tried to kill a few hours before. So these stakes are the highest yet. It's not one servant girl outside the courtyard. It's not a handful of officials and servants huddling around a fire. This is a relative of the man Peter tried to kill. Peter drew attention to himself in the garden, trying to chop off heads. Peter, there are eyewitnesses placing Peter as a disciple of Christ. They saw him there at the garden. And under the strongest pressure of the questioning so far, 1, 2, 3, Peter gives his strongest denials. We see that in the other Gospels, right? Peter gives a stronger denial with each questioning. None of this to the surprise of Jesus. He predicted this in chapter 13, right? We're in chapter 18 now. In chapter 13, verse 33, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." Since Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Or in other words, you'll have all night right, to follow up on your words, to prove your faithfulness to me, but you're not gonna. You're gonna deny knowing me. So in thinking about why Peter denied Christ, there are a few reasons. And the first is weakness, right? Why did Peter deny Christ? Well, it was weakness. And in other gospel accounts, when Jesus and some of the disciples go to the garden, Peter falls asleep. Jesus asks them to stay up and pray, knowing what's about to happen, knowing the trial they're about to endure. Jesus asks them, stay up and pray with me. But every time he goes back to check on the disciples, they're sleeping. And he warned Peter to pray. And he said, look, Peter, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So you have to pray. But instead of praying, Peter's sleeping. The second reason Peter denied is he's afraid. There's fear. And obviously, it's an appropriate emotion. He just saw an angry mob arrest Jesus in the middle of the night, take him away to some bogus trial, and being interrogated. And Peter was afraid that Jesus would die, and probably wondering if he's going to die too. So he's afraid, and so that's appropriate, but just because it's an appropriate emotion doesn't mean it's appropriate response. Peter denies Jesus because of fear. The last reason is because he's prideful. We see throughout the Gospels, all of them, that there's too many examples where Peter is overconfident, where he's boastful, where Peter's mouth is writing checks his bodies can't cash. He's thinking, he's acting without thinking, right? This is Peter's characteristic. He would say things that might sound good at the time, but they're unrealistic. In Psalm 16, verse 8, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And this denial of Christ 3 times is the most humbling moment of Peter's life, and exactly what was needed for Peter to be used by God. So here's what it means for us. For us, we have to fix our eyes on Jesus, right, in Hebrews. Fix your eyes on Jesus. When Peter was looking at Jesus, he's walking on water, right? It's when he looks at the wind and the waves, then he starts sinking. But even in the midst of Peter taking his eyes off of Jesus, when he says, Lord, save me, Jesus reaches down and saves him. Peter, in the garden, was not looking at Jesus. In the garden, he's looking at the soldiers. He's looking at the angry mob. Do you think if Peter was looking at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and do you think Jesus gave him the word, all right, let's cut off heads now? Of course not. Jesus is calm. Jesus is talking with the people. He's leading the situation. But Peter's out there trying to cut heads off. In the garden, Peter's not looking at Jesus. He's looking at the circumstances. And so for us, we must fix our eyes on Jesus, not our circumstances. And we understand then, we follow the example of Jesus and let him lead our lives. The second thing, as we already alluded to, is we have to pray because we're weak. On the night of the arrest, Jesus is begging them to pray because Jesus knows what's going on. He's you guys stay here and pray with me. He knew that they would need strength to remain faithful in the midst of this crisis they're about to go to. But a few hours. Now, look, I'm not saying that, if the apostles would have prayed for a few hours, then they would have been ready to handle any challenge. I'm not saying that. But it's more if they were cultivating a life of prayer, who knows how things would have gone differently. Jesus would have still been arrested and crucified, but Peter might not be trying to kill people at the garden, right? So we need to have a consistent life of prayer. and then our character is transformed. I'm not talking about having a prayer meeting for 1 hour a month, right? I'm talking about we need to have a consistent life of prayer, and then our character is transformed. Then when like crazy stuff happens, we understand, we fix our eyes on Jesus and understand how he wants us to respond to that. And the last thing, and we see from Peter's example, we learn from mistakes. Jesus knew Peter would fail. He predicted it in chapter 15, was it? And he also knew that Peter would learn from his mistakes. Guess who wrote this? Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. That was Peter. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, he learned from his mistakes and he understood that we have to be prepared. When we fail, like Peter, we cry out to Jesus. We pray for strength. We fix our eyes on Jesus. We learn from our mistakes. And then we proceed in the grace of God. Eventually, we're going to see that Jesus restores Peter, right? And then God uses him as like the main leader of the church in Jerusalem. What Jesus did through Peter, he wants to do through you and I. But we have to fix our eyes on Jesus. We have to pray, learn from our mistakes, and then live in God's grace. Can we pray?